Eric, on occasion, we put on an episode that we just know it's going to become a pillar of not only the Iron Culture community, but something that one can reflect back on to have new takeaways. And that is what we're experiencing today. We have the roundtable of roundtables. The mass boys are joining together to talk about how do we know what we know and what do we know? A conversation on epistemology and then the branches of empiricism, rationalism, how they're not mutually exclusive as some people might think, talking in a microcosm about the fitness industry, but then in general, how people may come to conclusions, why it's important to re-examine things, and just the entire scientific process that to an outsider, they might not be aware of. So getting an inside scoop into how the mass boys work and just, general principles was not only fascinating, I think there's been nothing like this elsewhere that I could think of in the fitness space.
No, this is a really cool episode. Now, I feel really just privileged to have this conversation and be able to air some of these thoughts. So we got the whole Mass team. And as you know, I'm a part of many cinematic universes, and Mass is one of them.
Sure.
We got Dr. Mike Zerdos, we got Greg Nuckols, and we got Dr. Eric Trexler on, and we got little old me. And we had a discussion about how we think, how we come to conclusions, how we reformulate ideas, how we update things, and ultimately how you, dear listener, can pick apart arguments and come to your own conclusions and hopefully the most likely to be right conclusions and get closer and closer to that over time when you see two seemingly science-based arguments that conflict. And that's by looking at them through the lens of rationalism and empiricism and weighing the strength of both empirical evidence, which we've talked about before, the hierarchy of evidence, but also, as Greg gets into in this, the strength of rationalist arguments, which is something that is often missed. And this is a common trope that we see, where you're presented with a mechanism and a story, heavy physiology, and then broad statements that are stated with confidence. And that's something Dr. Ben House talked about. So this is a really good carry on from that episode. So now let's just say that this episode was so good, folks, and it created so much vigor and excitement in all of us that it ended really well, but also unfortunately, and that we've been plunged back into a status of war. We're not going to address that here because it's still, I think the fire is still rich in our bloods right now.
It's burning hot.
Burning hot. And Omar and I are here just trying to cool each other off. Like he's taking off my clothes, I'm taking off him. He's blowing on me, and opening some windows. Yeah, we're just trying to keep each other cooled off. So we got to do that first before we make a statement. So be wary. The next episode of Iron Culture, we're going to address this head on, but we don't want to take away from the awesome discussion. So tune in, listen close. This is one to listen to twice, I would say, because you're going to learn how to learn.
Eric, we've been accused by our haters that our intros take way too damn long. We don't get to the point. We don't talk about the topic that we list in the title. So we're going to completely address that by just jumping right into this episode. We have the Mass Boys, okay? We have... There's a lot of strong lads, a lot of smart lads. The best of IG lifting when it comes to knowledge is dropping straight bombs today. Talking about how do we know what we know. Talking a little bit about empiricism, rationalism, first principles, innate principles, various things. And I think if we can just kick it off, Eric, by introducing the guests and probably summarizing their training philosophy by their signature slogan, and that could hopefully encapsulate their beliefs, and then we could try and, as we do in every single episode, build bridges between everyone. That would be useful. So I think the first one would be, we have, of course, Mike Zordos. Mike Zordos, his training philosophy, his motto is just train harder. That's period, is what he says, what he'll repeat on the internet, social media. Greg Nuckols, returning once again, three-peat at the very least. I believe his training philosophy is it's still your motherfucking set. And that, once again, just encapsulates what he's about. And then finally, we have none other than, I think this might be a third or fourth time, Eric Trexler, whose training philosophy, well, it's not really, I don't know if it's a philosophy, but it's pain don't hurt much. And in that way, we could just bring everyone together with their various beliefs, see if we could build those bridges, Eric, and really address how do we know what we know, not only in training, but outside of training.
I like it. I think taking those well-known and well-stated training philosophies of each of these people is a great way to introduce them. We could also talk about how, they're part of Mass, which I've heard is pretty good. I have a loose affiliation, being one of his co-owners, but I think that's probably the best intro, Omar. So I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about now owning things and whatnot, because we are completely against those notions that we merely critique capitalism around here. So we decided, yes, we're promoting something that, sure, some of our guests have a vested interest in, but is that not the function of capitalism, to accrue as much personal wealth as one can? So if we merely mention that Mass is a fantastic monthly application in strength sports that one can sign up for, you could go ahead and you could go to strongerbyscience.com. You could sign up to it there. We're just promoting good knowledge and good resources is what I personally feel. So it is an honor to share the stage, so to speak, with the four of you.
Well, we're all mutual owners of Mass, so one could, I think, rightly interpret it as a workers-owned collective rather than a capitalist enterprise. That's what I do personally.
I mean, we did bust that union that tried to form that one time, so I don't know where that sits in between the two, but nonetheless.
I mean, Omar, I love two things. One, Omar sounds like a regular Ludwig von Mises over there. And, also I just love how you guys' intros are just improvised. There's no practicing. Clearly nothing was written down, and just off the cuff, just coming up with those, everything is great. It's really impressive.
Thank you. Direct, concise, specific, related to the topic at hand. And the person who dared critique our intros is now surely feeling like they made a mistake. Not in that they were wrong, because we've proved them to be right, but then they made the critique at all because it only fueled the flames that are whatever these intros. I'm not even sure it is an intro, because what are we introducing right now besides our own bloated hot air? So let's get right to it. Honor to have all of these at least three-peat guests back on. After that, you're pretty much just running across the finish line backwards, holding the champagne bottle like Usain Bolt. And glad to have you guys on. And what I wanted to talk to you about is adjacent, I would say, is a meta discussion around the recent P ratio debate that I found really interesting. Dr. Trexler, you did a fantastic job on this. It all started in the wee recent pages of Mass, where we took a look at this concept, and it's evolved into some back and forth. And without rehashing...
It's evolved into a full cinematic universe with several sequels, and we're working on another spin-off project that's in production. So, yeah.
It's the Marvel universe of the fitness space.
Exactly, yeah.
And when you figure out whether or not you'll be going with Netflix or Disney Plus, I'll get whichever platform you're on. But yeah, I think that without rehashing the P ratio debate, because that's really only I'd say a foil for the discussion. There were a couple of conversations we had when discussing this internally that I thought would be really great for the listener, as they ultimately come down to: how do we know what we know? How do we learn things? How do we critique and evaluate the things that we think we know? And how do we guard ourselves against incorrect conclusions and make as many correct conclusions as possible? And how do we update our beliefs over time? And Greg, you did a great job of juxtaposing empiricism and rationalism as kind of the initial aspect of this. And Eric, I think recently you really showed nicely in some of your rebuttals to rebuttals and initial rebuttals to the concept of a P ratio, that if you have enough knowledge, you can rationalize with a plausible hypothesis or theory most things. Not anything, of course, but something that's in the realm of physiological possibility, which is a broad realm, or complex things, and come to a conclusion that may or may not be correct, but you have to empirically assess those conclusions. So, or hypotheses, I should say. So first, Greg, I want to kick it over to you, and can you delve a little bit deeper into what was the heart of what you were getting at when you were discussing that paradigm?
So I think that when different people or different groups of people are trying to accurately and honestly evaluate evidence and arguments and come to the correct conclusion about anything. Could be a scientific topic, could be a political topic, could be whatever else, like the many things where there are differences of opinion. Oftentimes you will find people talking past each other, and that could boil down to a lot of different causes. So, maybe the sorts of evidence that people accept are different. Maybe, different sources of information, people just have differing degrees of trust in them. But oftentimes it comes down to different global patterns of thinking. And I think that there are very few pure rationalists or pure empiricists out there, but I do think a lot of people tend to lean more one way or the other. So just to ground us here, rationalism is, they're both broadly approaches to epistemology, which is a subset of philosophy fundamentally about knowledge and how can we claim to know what we claim to know. And the idea behind rationalism is essentially that you can know things and have higher degrees of confidence in things that you claim to know or suspect to be true, largely based on reason. And historically, it's been more of a focus on deductive reason and logic. So basically, if you start with a set of premises, and if those premises are correct, and you use the correct forms of logic to work your way through them, if those premises are correct and your logic is sound, you should spit out a correct conclusion based on those inputs. And I mean, there's more to it than that. But that's kind of the way that a rationalist will approach things. So start with like what we think we know, what general question or topic we're trying to discuss, and starting with things we know, like what can we deduce about this subject that we're interested in. And an empiricist, on the other hand, tends to be more interested in data itself. So the empiricism predates what we think of as science. The original empiricists were more about like knowledge is what we can derive via our senses, not necessarily just via our rational reasoning faculties. And then like basically empiricism became more and more formalized over time into what is now the scientific process. But if you're an empiricist, instead of necessarily saying like, okay, let's start from first principles and things we either know to be true or assume to be true and try to deduce our way to an answer, you say like, okay, what are we interested in? Is there relevant data on this already that we can just look at? Or if not, how might we be able to design an experiment to answer this question directly that we're interested in? There are absolutely rationalist elements to empiricism. So, like I said, rationalism dovetails a lot with formal logic and logicians. And so, I mean, like, not going to go too far into like philosophy of science, but ultimately, like, if you want to know how can you collect good data that will be able to adequately answer a question, you can't necessarily collect data on that. So like there are going to be some a priori assumptions and some rationalist thought that goes into any empirical approach. And then similarly with rationalism, you're generally starting with things that you know, like you're generally starting with established facts and trying to reason from there. And a lot of those things that you're taking as established facts and relationships, a lot of that is going to come from empirical work that you're beginning with. If you're not accepting that, if you're a pure rationalist, you basically start at Descartes and you're like, okay, well, I know I'm thinking, therefore I exist. And now let's go from there and try to recreate all human knowledge, and like good fucking luck. Starting with cogito ergo sum and winding up with, yeah, and that's why we should do sets of 5 instead of sets of 8. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So like the two very much fit together. Like, you need some degree of rationalism, you need some degree of empiricism. But I do think a lot of disagreements come down to, people who are more rationalist, and will try to think their way through problems before necessarily looking for evidence, or, may put more weight on trains of logic arriving at a certain answer than they will evidence that maybe they don't have maybe quite as much faith in, especially if it contradicts what they believe to be more logical, versus someone who's an empiricist where, even if something seems illogical, if that's the way the data is leaning, they're going to go with the data. So yeah, I could have probably been more succinct, but I think that's enough to kind of get our feet wet.
No, my feet feel wet. I feel like that was a really good way of presenting it. I kind of the logical construct that I have with this is that rationalism advances with our empirical knowledge, and in some ways, if you think about the two skill sets, your brain's ability to rationalize and make those logical arguments, write a hypothesis, for example, if you're an actual researcher thinking about when you do this formally, that's kind of like the engine. But your engine can only take you so far if you don't have a sufficient body of research to base it on. And that empirical knowledge, if you're behind on that, you're working with incorrect first assumptions. And I also can think of many times, and Mike, this is where I actually want to kick it over to you, where something that is logical, based on what we currently know, ends up being false in the literature, and sometimes vice versa. And I can think of times where researchers who both you and I know probably leaned too far on empiricism, and when they don't see a relationship, and probably in not a large enough body of data or appropriate amount of data, they're quick to jump ship and go against first physiological principles. Likewise, we see it the other way, where someone is holding on to poorer levels of data because that's the way they see things logically. And invariably, both of those end up going the incorrect direction from probably the truth. So, Mike, I wanted to talk to you, since you have probably the most extensive experience as an academic, looking at research, seeing kind of the way the winds have blown. I think publishing the most out of all of us. Can you give us some examples of this, your take on it, and when you've seen logic and data go separate paths, at least based on our current knowledge?
Yeah, for sure, Eric. So to start on the rationalist side of things, there's nothing wrong in a sense with, hey, let me rationally think this through, right? And that's somebody's starting point, and saying, all right, I have this idea. I want to know if this fleshes out in practice, whether it's training or something else. But it's as Greg was getting at, how far you take it. And then, you go with it for a while, you work on that in practice. You're not a scientist, you train yourself. You see this is kind of working, but you're not sold on it. And you just have to be open to being willing to take a look at what else is out there. And it doesn't mean it's especially in this field, this practical field, people take it too far either way, as you said, Eric. It doesn't mean something comes out and it completely discounts that idea. It might just mean there's a lack of evidence in the area to fully accept it as fact. And then on the other side of it, as you pointed out, empiricism, the biggest one, that's been around this in the past, I'd say 5-ish, 6-ish years, is the concept of periodization for strength and resistance training. And, this was accepted for a very long time that, hey, periodizing protocols is good for strength adaptation. But the evidence surrounding it isn't thin in that it doesn't exist, but is thin in that some of the studies aren't super well carried out. They're underpowered. The statistics were a little bit shoddy. And around that, then the question of that Greg was part of a review paper on as well, is muscle growth related to strength, and more specifically, is muscle growth a causative factor in strength adaptation? And so while we have a ton of evidence to suggest that it is, one of the pushbacks is, hey, there's no longitudinal empirical study showing this direct cause. And okay, that's not the most unfair statement in the world. But we have to be careful, I think, because of what Helms is getting at, which is, and I would have a twofold response to this, without getting into the data, because I believe there is enough data to suggest that muscle growth is a factor in strength adaptation. But to push back on hey, we need this empirical long-term evidence on that so hard on that side is one, the famous parachute meta-analysis, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. And it sums up something to the extent of course, it's not the researchers did this to be facetious in a way and put together a meta-analysis saying, hey, we scanned the literature essentially for data looking at does parachutes save lives in skydiving, and there's no evidence to suggest that they do. There's no randomized controlled trials carried out on this topic, therefore we need more data to suggest this. Obviously, if you don't have a parachute that's working, you're not going skydiving. And so, that's on the whole other side of now we're taking this too literally. And so, of course, lifting weights isn't nearly as consequential as looking at something in terms of a field to save lives or a new drug or whatever it might be, or the skydiving reference. But, in terms of the other factor I want to get to on, let's say, muscle growth and strength is that and I find it ironic when people are saying, well, you don't really want to guess either way then, because it could be dangerous. It could lead to you making inappropriate conclusions in your research or designing a study this way. But you have to hedge your bets one way or the other because people have to lift weights. So how are you going to coach this person?
Have to.
Must.
Yeah,
required.
I can't conceive of another way of life.
Right. So if
yeah, there's no bias in this chat by any means, but clearly every individual must lift weights. Go on, Mike.
Yeah, obviously. I don't know why somebody was laughing. That's very confusing. But now that
it's a self-evident truth.
Now that I can continue on the logical path that I was on, because
we hold these truths to be self-evident. Oh, that's actually a great example of rationalism. Like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, blah, blah, blah. And then you kind of deduce what rights flow from that.
Innate knowledge.
The founders of the U.S. were big-time rationalists for the most part.
It's a good point. And yeah, so, you kind of have to hedge your bets one way or another, because if someone has a goal in strength sport, they have to lift weights. And so you have to be able to say, okay, I think that muscle growth is a good idea for strength. And based upon the evidence that is available, it is also the clearest conclusion is that you would hedge your bets that way over the very long term. So, to say, hey, we don't have this long-term empirical study clearly demonstrating the causality of muscle growth on strength adaptation, that in and of itself isn't a bad statement. The question is, what do you do with that statement? Saying, hey, I want to investigate this over the very long term also isn't a bad statement. It's saying, I want to investigate this. However, at the moment, the data, if you had to hedge your bets and train, the data does show, we would suggest most logically that muscle growth is a causative factor of strength adaptation. Therefore, without gaining some size and getting as big as possible, you're not going to maximize strength. So the problem isn't necessarily when taking empiricism too far, isn't the statement necessarily that, hey, we need this long-term data. The problem is, what do you do with that statement? And I think sometimes then we can take that statement too far. And I don't want anybody to think I'm going on the other side and now I'm going all rationalist. But to answer your question, that's, I think, the danger on the other side. So with almost anything, there's ends of the spectrum, and wherever there's gaps, do you deal with them logically, or do you deal with them, I'm going about this rational, this counters my view, so I'm staying with this, or I'm an empiricist, this long-term data isn't there, but everything else points to this, where am I going with this? And so if everything else points to this, you're not going to, let's say, administer a drug that's not approved because that could harm somebody. But you might say, yeah, I'm going to do some hypertrophy training because that's probably a good idea for strength. So that's the take on the other side.
No, I think that's well said, Mike. And I think what you're getting at to some degree is that what do we do in the face of less than ideal or direct evidence? And I think a really, really too hardcore empirical kind of straw man that I've been alluding to might just reject it completely, despite indirect evidence or our understanding of rationalism with a certain, a priori level of physiology knowledge. Where I see this a lot is actually in nutrition, where most of the time for health specifically, we care about longitudinal outcomes like all-cause mortality and looking at odds ratios. And people's favorite pet nutrient, if there is any kind of epidemiological association they don't like that scares them, they will go, where's the RCTs? And, so for example, you showed in 40,000 people that higher protein intake seemed to be associated with cancer. That scares the crap out of me. I don't, in these 1 year or 2 year long RCTs, there's no relationship. Okay, I'm good to go. Now, for the record, I don't think high protein intakes are a higher risk of all-cause mortality, but that's actually not an accurate way to go, because can we actually do an RCT where we are controlling for protein and the outcome that we're measuring is death? No, that's not a thing. So what's the best level of empiricism we can have? It's going to be all of the indirect stuff. So by dismissing, direct causative, the lack of direct, by dismissing a notion with a lack of direct causative research, you are sometimes, in certain cases, dismissing the best evidence that you can exist. And I think that's probably the case in the hypertrophy and its role in periodization, because we are not going to be able to fully separate those things, and we are going to have some indirect lines of research to support that. And I think that's where it gets challenging, and we have to figure out the appropriate combination of these things. So yeah, I really appreciate that, Mike. Trex, I want to kick it over to you, my man. So I think you've done an excellent job in highlighting the balance of these two things, and how you've discussed some of the initial hypothesis that came around P ratios and the rebuttal that came to them. And in both cases, we're super rationalism heavy here. We've got theories. It's inflammation, or potentially it is actually testosterone levels, or hold on, wait, actually it is the insulin model. And we're looking at, intolerance and inability to shuttle nutrients to muscle, and a likelihood that you'll have poor body recomposition metrics. And you kind of said, okay, interesting theories. Where's the data? So talk to me about how you work your way through this and where you find the middle ground.
Yeah, so I guess, I'll put my cards on the table first. I lean more toward being an empiricist, not purely. I think, we have to have some rationalist aspects to our way of thinking, but there's a couple key reasons why I've become more of an empiricist over time. The first one is parsimony. I'm proudly, I should say, part of the nutrition department at Mass. And in the world of nutrition, there's just, excuse my language, I know it's a family show, there's just new bullshit every week. And you can always rationalize your way to the bullshit. Think of every piece of pseudoscience in like weird fringe alternative medicine, the weird nutrition cults that, have all sorts of techniques they swear by. If you ask them, what's this based on? They don't say, you know what? I never thought about it. Good point. I don't know why we're doing it. It's always, oh, well, as we know, and they start with a granule of truth that at one point was empirically derived, and then they just go. And they don't stop. They get to their conclusion. And what you can find is that if you've been in the nutrition game long enough, you start to recognize, wow, you can work your way to a lot of different places, and only few of them actually turn out to be correct in the long run.
One of my favorite examples of how that can work out is the British Medical Journal, I believe. Their Christmas issue from time to time, or maybe every year, they have like some joke articles in them. One was, does garlic actually protect you against vampires? And they're like, well, we couldn't find any vampires, but we think that the leech model is an adequate experimental model for this. So like, let's apply garlic to people and see if that affects the probability of leeches latching on. But anyway, so for an extreme example of how far you can get with rationalism. They had an article one year that was about how smoking cigarettes is great for endurance athletes. And basically what the person did is like he found all of these in vitro studies and mechanistic studies and just like little things where if you took them all in isolation and said like, okay, if we assume this is everything we knew about smoking, we can definitely argue our way towards, you know, cigarettes being a great ergogenic aid for marathon runners, which is obviously completely batshit insane. But like you can 100% get from smoking cigarettes to better marathon times via rationalism, just for like and not, you know, not that anyone's actually promoting that, but just for a extreme illustration of what Trex is talking about.
Oh, and there's many out there. Have you guys seen the one about how the similarities in our physiology, if you go way back long enough in our DNA to plant life, that ATP in certain cells can actually generate ATP from light. And then through some gaps in our knowledge, the eventual conclusion is that if you live near the equator, you need less food. And if you keep taking it, you don't need to eat if you get constant sunlight. Have you heard that one?
Yeah.
No,
I haven't, but I mean, then you're a breatharian, which seems to be a thriving group.
Yeah. Yeah, you just need to basically not be in an area with a lot of cloud cover, and eating is no longer a necessity for you. And now, granted, there may be some errors in the biochemistry, but they map it all out. I am just not a biochemist. I have a sufficient amount of that knowledge to, you know, lift weights. So I could be wrong, and maybe someone with really, really hardcore physiology will be able to get it, but 99.99% of the people who are consuming that information, it is far above their level if I know that I can't spot the hole. But I do know that you need to eat. So I think that's an obvious example too.
Well,
Eric, we cut you off. But
yeah.
go for it.
Since I moved to Florida, my grocery bill is lower. So what's up?
Well, there's a tick in opposition. So we'll keep that as part of our data set empirically.
Yeah, I was going to say, at least we're getting empirical with it. You know, we have data now.
That's right.
But no, I mean, I think the thing that got me with the whole P ratio thing that kicked this off is like, if you need to stretch really hard and think of, has insulin ever been misapplied on a mechanistic level? It's like, I don't know. Have you read anything in nutrition in the last 15 years? Like James Krieger wrote like a book on the 1 million ways you can misapply insulin physiology and get to conclusions that are not compatible with empirical data. So anyway, yeah, part of it was just, I've been in nutrition for a minute, and I've seen a lot of people beating themselves up doing all these pain in the ass interventions that don't seem to actually bring them anything good. And that sucks. So I'm kind of biased toward a more parsimonious approach whenever it can be justified. I've seen all these rational interventions that just don't pan out and make your life way harder. Another thing that makes me lean toward empiricism is that I am an amateur armchair statistician. Like, there are a couple lab groups that send me data to analyze for them, and it's a thing I do, a bit of a hobby. And I mean, when you're trained in stats, then they tell you, build a model that explains as much variance in your outcome as you can without any dead weight. If you've got predictors in your model that are not meaningfully contributing to the model fit, drop them. They're not important enough to justify carrying them along for the ride. And so for me, as an empiricist who's, I think, relatively pragmatic when it comes to practical approaches, I've always thought, listen, if you've got a theory and it's on something that should be very observable in the data, and I look through the data for many, many, many hours, and I can't find anything that's remotely compatible with it, let's assume it's true. How important could that be? If it's not important enough and meaningful enough to observe, why would I beat myself up trying to apply it? Like, if we can't even find the slightest hint of it actually panning out. So I am biased toward empiricism for that reason. And also because, as Greg kind of alluded to, or I don't know, it's either Greg or Helms. You guys look very similar. I can't tell.
We get that a lot.
But one of the things that goes into rationalism is you pretty much have to sign up for some assumptions on the front end. You know, you basically have to go into it thinking, okay, we understand all the components fully. We have all the necessary information. We have no blind spots. There are no unknown interactions that we haven't accounted for. We know how every part of the system is going to function, not just in general, but in this context, you know, with all these other factors in play. And so you have to make a lot of assumptions that you fully understand that this is going to pan out, and there is nothing that you're missing in this entire kind of pathway that you're putting together rationally. So that's kind of my general approach. And so when it came to, I think, Helms, your question was about like the approach to this particular project with the P ratio thing.
I think that's a perfectly fine way of interpreting it. That's a good foil to get it. I want to get a little bit of insight into where you balance the two. How do you get to where you get? And as we often find ourselves in the fitness industry, we're facing something that has an evidence-basiness, but isn't really on firm footing. So how do you tackle something that at first view certainly seems based on physiology, but comes to a conclusion that may not necessarily have empirical weight?
Yeah, I think for me, you know, I always have the hierarchy of evidence in mind, and I always have a general tendency, you know, if something is observable, I'd sure like to observe it. You know, that makes me feel better as a bit of an empiricist. So with a hierarchy of evidence in mind, and with that little bit of a bias toward empiricism, my first thought is, what is the most generalizable, closest evidence that one might be able to find? You know, if this effect is true and real and meaningful and important, where might I get a glimpse of that in the literature that already exists? Because I think it's a very defeatist attitude to say, no one's done a huge RCT on this exact topic the exact way I want, therefore, I guess we'll never know. I mean, that's really not, in my opinion, a suitable way to approach these things, because then everything's on the table. Like, and you're not obligated to be an evidence-based practitioner, or, you know, you don't have to say, oh, I like the evidence-based thing, but if you are into that whole evidence-based thing, there's not always going to be that perfect RCT that's just teed up for you. You do have to sometimes, unfortunately, work your way down the hierarchy. But I'd still say, let's start at the top and work our way down. And so what I often look at is, like, sometimes people, I think, draw the line way too far down the hierarchy. I almost said the pyramid, but I know it's a trademark term. I almost got sued.
We'll cut that out. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Brandon, edit it out.
Bleep it out. Don't cut it. Bleep it.
We want a strong bleep.
Yeah. Just start referring to it as the ziggurat of evidence.
So
talk to our foreign language lawyer on that. So synonyms are also potentially protected, but case law, we'll see.
Yeah.
Precedent.
In the Babylonian translation of your books, is it referred to as the muscle and strength ziggurats?
We're still working that out. That's again, okay. It's touch and go.
It's a hot topic, Greg.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So anyway, if I may continue, Greg, a lot of times we've got this idea, right? So in this case, P ratios, body fat, etc. And so you could start at the bottom of the hierarchy and say, do we have like cell culture evidence, or like fruit fly evidence, or like rodent evidence? And maybe you do have some kind of glimmer of a mechanism there. And then the question is, do you say, okay, cool, fine, stop. No one look for anything else. We got what we need. Let's get out of here. Like, I don't think that's the best way to do it. You say, well, okay, but do we have any relevant human stuff that we can lean on? Yes. Okay, well, do we have any human stuff in the population we're trying to apply this to? So younger, healthy folks, you know, whether they have low, moderate, high body fat, people that are otherwise generally healthy, you know, do we have that? Yes, we do. Are they lifting? Because that would be very convenient. And then the answer is yes, you know? So like you kind of work your way up and you're like, okay, how much can we get here? Can we get human? Can we get young, healthy human? Can we get young, healthy human who's lifting? And then I'll admit, even I come in clean. I drew the line too early. I said, listen, we've got football players, we've got these folks, we've got those folks, we've got cross-sectional data. Do you ever look at a super heavyweight powerlifter and say, imagine how muscular and strong they could be if they just lost a ton of weight? I've never heard anybody say that, but that's okay. But then Greg was like, I mean, there's open data sets of studies that are literally about hypertrophy in literally young, healthy, resistance trained men who literally all have a body fat percentage. And I was like, oh yeah, there are. And so then we're like, dude, I'll admit I drew the line too early based on, cross-sectional stuff that's generalizable, but not perfectly so. There are issues with the football generalizations for sure. And so then I was like, damn, you're right. And so we got together all these data sets. Very good people helped us out, by the way, people who contributed some of the data sets. And yeah, we were able to basically say, okay, well, we're interested in hypertrophy and we think there's going to be a relationship between an individual's body fat and their ability to achieve hypertrophy longitudinally. We have the longitudinal hypertrophy data. We have their baseline body fats. This study, these studies were not about this question, but they could have been. They have literally all the information that you would need. And so is it 100% perfect? No. People have pointed out it didn't control for, energy balance on a subject by subject level. Although if they did, it would have made our results stronger. And the data very clearly show that. But, so it wasn't the picture perfect study. But if you're going to throw out all hypertrophy work that doesn't control energy balance on a subject by subject level, you're not going to have much left. And you don't have really any supplement knowledge whatsoever at that point. So I think we should be careful about throwing stones at a study that hasn't controlled for, minutes of sleep per night and everything. Cause you're going to be making conclusions based on similarly weak data in other areas. So unless you're going to sign up for that as a limitation across the board, you should probably, maybe not lean into it too hard.
And Dr.
But yeah,
Trexler,
so
I would say not even in other areas, every critique that someone could level at the ad hoc meta you guys did could be leveled at 10 times strength at the original Forbes model that wasn't on people lifting and was on special populations, that wasn't a randomized selection of studies either, but was it's unclear the selection criteria for how that got grouped together.
It's fewer subjects. None of them lifted. Many of them were recovering from anorexia. Others were rebounding from total starvation. It wasn't a mixed model that accounts for, between study variance. It didn't have independent or individual subject level data. So it just had to go on group means in terms of the body fat relationship. There were a lot of gaps there. And so I was surprised at how people were like, oh man, this analysis you guys did has nothing to do with the research question. And it's like, I mean, if you were going to design the study, that's pretty much how you'd go about doing it, with just maybe a few other controls in place, but controls that we can suss out statistically. And we did look into. So, and I'm not saying that it's, perfect by any means, but to answer your question, that was the general concept, is how close can we get? How far can we work our way up that hierarchy without drawing the line prematurely? And like I said, I drew the line early, and then Greg is smarter than me and said, keep going. And I was like, damn it, it sounds like a lot of work. And he said, I know, but don't come back unless you're going to do all that work. And I said, fine. So, I mean, there were a lot of threats. It got ugly. It was heated.
You said that sounds like a lot of work. And I said, well, okay, I'll be the one to find the data sets. And you said, okay, that's fine.
We're getting dangerously
I'm the only
close.
one with enough self-hatred to spend 2 days on Google's fucking data set search tool.
Well, then 20 minutes later, you had 2 data sets.
We're getting dangerously close to what our lawyers said we shouldn't talk about with that union busting I referred to earlier.
Yeah.
Needless to say, Trex is still a member of Mass and Stronger by Science.
Yeah.
At present time. It depends when we publish this, Eric.
Yeah, as of 5:08 p.m. But no, I mean, that's kind of the general approach. And that's the approach I take to most things. If we don't have direct data, then let's get the best stuff we have. And I think more importantly, the guiding principle that I think is critical, whenever you're rationalizing about a topic where we are lacking empirical data, even if you can't find the empirical data, when you're dealing with variables that can be quantified, they should be quantified. So one of the examples I put in the P ratio article was no one's out there saying that a handful of almonds is going to kill you, but they do have cyanide in them. And so like if all I'm going to do is draw like, well, listen, does cyanide kill people? It certainly has. That's science. And do almonds have cyanide? They certainly do. And if we're not going to talk about magnitudes and thresholds and dose response relationships, if it's just like, listen, here's A, B, and C, you do the math, draw the lines, clearly almonds will kill you. That obviously in that scenario falls short because we have enough empirical data to know, yeah, they actually don't. But yeah, I think that was one of the things that killed me with some of the rationalist type ideas is like, well, you know, we know inflammation prevents hypertrophy. And then you look at the citation and it's like people that are acutely hospitalized and 84 years old and the resistance training program is six days long and their inflammation levels are, you know, 8 to 10 times higher than you would expect to be in a bariatric surgery patient pre-operation. And so if you're using that to tell me I shouldn't be 16% body fat, I'm going to push back.
I don't understand why, but okay.
Yeah.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think not everyone is going to be a trained scientist. So I know those listening, to give you some things to take away, a lot of the times we are operating with insufficient evidence to make recommendations because, like Mike so correctly said, and we believe here at Iron Culture, you have to lift. So when you lift, you have to make a decision about how to lift. And sometimes you have to make those decisions with the best available evidence. And sometimes it is just going to be based on some physiological principles and then the logic that extends from it. And that means that we have a lot of these, I would say, houses of cards built in lifting, even in the evidence-based community, just because we have an insufficient, and we will for a long time, data set. And I would argue that P ratios were one of them. It was built on, you know, the Forbes model. That's the closest thing we had to empirical support. And then, you know, take your pick of one of three different physiological rationalist hypotheses. So then the question is, all right, well, what do you do once we look at the existing data? Because there wasn't actually new data. It's been there all along. We just finally decided maybe we should question this, which we need to do from time to time. So what do we do when we have something that feels well-established? And by well-established at this point, I just mean something that's become de facto truth or assumption, regardless of the evidence behind it. Well, once you start seeing that evidence, you're going to have a natural tendency to want to dispute it because you've operated in a certain way. That's fine. That's natural. You're not a bad evidence-based practitioner for that. However, the level of critique that you apply towards the new incoming perspective, you also need to mirror that on what you currently have. A great example here is if you are attacking a properly done meta-analysis comparatively to one that you have that is weaker. Now you've also, let's just use the P ratio example, if you use an equal level of criticism, all right, I disregard the in-house meta that Trexler did. Now I also have to disregard the Forbes model that I have. And now what are you left with? You're left purely with mechanisms and no direct empirical data on that side. And now you have indirect data that was, you know, what Trexler very humbly said was, I didn't go far enough. I think it was plenty sufficiently far compared to what you were comparing it against in this argument. So I think it's all just cherries on the top of the proverbial cupcake that you guys did the meta. I think that's a good way of going about it. So when you're presented with two things, whatever critique and level of critical thinking and discernment that you apply to what's incoming also needs to be mirrored back on what you currently have. And that'll really help you get to where you want to go. And if you find you are resistant to doing that, if you apply the principle of charity to what you already believe, but a high level of skepticism to what's incoming, that's a fantastic way to notice your own biases, which, by the way, we all have, just to put it out there.
Yeah, and if I could add one thing, there's going to be a spot where, let's say that you disregard, like you said, the evidence on this side, the evidence on that side, you're back to mechanisms. A lot of people, and that's justifiable, you know, like you said, if you're going to apply that level of very strict vetting of the data on both sides, totally fine. But then you get to a spot where you're like, well, then I don't have any data I feel good about. Then I think my personal perspective and the official perspective of the classically trained scientist would be, then you probably ought to bias yourself toward the null hypothesis when all else is equal. And so if you're someone who is, 17% body fat and you're like, am I allowed to bulk? I don't want to cut. My life would be a lot easier if I didn't cut, and I just want to get really big and strong and muscular. Must I cut in order to do that successfully? The null hypothesis would be, unless you have convincing data to make you do what you don't want to do, you probably shouldn't. You kind of have to be talked into making that decision that rejects the null hypothesis and forces you to do some stuff that you don't want to do. So I think it's very fair to say, like, you know what? I'm not convinced by the argument that's been put forward. That's totally fine. But if you find yourself where you are really torn about what to do, I think it's helpful to lean toward the null hypothesis, especially if it makes your life a lot easier and prevents you from doing something that you really don't want to do. And I will also say that in the specific case we've been talking about, one of the things we are adamant about in the article is that we did not disprove a damn thing. We didn't disprove the hypothesized relationship whatsoever. That would be a huge overextension of what we did. But our conclusion is, if this effect is real, and maybe it is, we looked very, very hard and can't find it. And that at bare minimum questions how practically relevant and critical it is to actually make decisions based upon it. So that I thought, honestly, everybody was going to be stoked, because it was like, hey, your life's easier than you used to think it is. Like, you don't have to worry about jumping through these hoops and getting to the perfect body fat to put on muscle. Well,
that's where you missed out, because anytime you remove the ability to shame others, or most importantly yourself in the fitness industry, you're going to get pushback. So you should have seen that one coming, Trex.
Yeah, I mean, as a coach, I always get people who they're getting started and they're like, do I need to cut before we put on muscle? And I'm like, do you want to be leaner than you are currently? And they're like, absolutely not. And I'm like, well, great news. Then we don't have to. And I truly thought that was going to be widely embraced, and that wasn't the case.
It reminds me of, what Trex said, lean towards the null in some of these cases. And so if you think of supplement research, and let's say an early study comes out, and to steal a term that both Trex and Helms have used in mass recently is, you want to be a late adopter. And if something comes out and there's an early study that might have had some flaws, might have had some conflict of interest, whatever it might be, and it showed an effect in favor of the supplement, and then everybody starts jumping on board. But this supplement's very expensive. And then the body of literature comes out and shows, hey, this really isn't doing anything. That's a win. Great, I get to save this money. And it makes, as Trex said, it makes my life a lot easier. I don't have to worry about taking this. I don't have to worry about spending this money. But there's going to be the majority of people almost who fight that and want to hold on to this and want to continue to take that supplement. So I think leaning towards the null in that case is such a good thing. And I didn't write anything down, so I'm trying to remember. Things kept coming to my head. But, so I really think that is a great point. And then additionally, to go on what Helms was saying, when you think of, an argument, and you think of saying, hey, you need to be able to mirror that criticism. I think an important thing too is you should really be able to argue both sides of something. And that shows that it's not just that you can support your point, but that you truly understand the other point. And this is in anything, right? How many times you see people argue over something politically and they're just saying whatever back and forth, and of course it doesn't lead to anything. They've never tried to understand the other side of it. Even if that other side, you could come to the conclusion that the ultimately what people also miss out on this is the outcome. What's the downstream outcome of whatever they're doing? You could argue that outcome is wrong. They're not trying to understand how that person got there, and since they don't understand the outcome, they aren't able to argue the other side. So it's not just about supporting what you're saying. If to truly be able to do that, you have to understand that other side of it and to be able to argue that. And then the last point is, Helms, you said evidence. I can't remember the term, but kind of evidence-based community or whatever it was that you noted. And I think that's,
Evidence-based.
I'm not going to say that because that sounds lame, but you know, I've said this a lot over the past 2 years, which is that on something like programming, we're all guessing a little bit outside of the general truths, if you will, that volume to an extent is related to muscle growth. How much volume? I don't know, right? I can you know, figure things out, right? You know, outside of higher intensity is generally better for strength adaptations, right? General statements like that. Which type of periodization is the best? We're guessing. Like, I have some thoughts. I break down the data that way. We're guessing on what type of programming. When should you use these strategies or that strategies? How should we program? We're all guessing. And anybody tells you who they're not guessing a little bit, that's just not honest. Like, we're guessing. I have an individual and I'm more confident for this individual than someone else. And everything's based upon the same principles of data. But we're all guessing a little bit, and everything is conceptual that we're using in that. So I would caution everybody in the fitness industry to understand that we are, to use Helms's terms, working on a bit of a house of cards and some of the training recommendations. I'm not going to speak as confidently on nutrition, which is not my area. But
It is.
yeah, well, it's tough. You know, Greg and I were having a training meeting, and I walked down the hall last week, and I knocked on the nutrition department door, and we didn't get our donuts in the break room that day, and they did. And the things that I was called for going on there, and it's so unfortunate because Helms and I just walked out of a video department meeting earlier that morning, and I thought that was his number one department, but you know, it was just difficult. So I filed the HR complaint. We have our hearing next week, and you know, we'll see what they say about it. But we're all guessing a little bit when it comes to programming. So I just think those are important points. You know, leading towards the null. You know, the conceptual topic, and then being able to understand the other side of an argument and being able to argue both sides. I tell my students that all the time. You know, when I teach my classes, if I say I expect you to come out of this semester disagreeing with me on something. If I didn't do my job, and if you're not questioning me because I am guessing, I think what I'm telling you is true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be telling you. But I could be wrong, and I give them examples. When I first taught this course, I taught this, I taught this, I taught this. I don't believe that anymore. And you should come out of here disagreeing with me on something. And I just think that that's, you know, important. So I argue both sides of it to them. I don't tell them what my opinion is, but I argue both sides of it to them. And so I think that's important. So just to parallel off of what both Eric said.
Mike,
And
that's
Mike,
actually
one of the things you said there that I really liked. I'm sorry, Helms.
you go for
I'm
it.
just going to co-host the show today, if you don't mind.
You got a lot of experience.
No, but I love that Mike said confidence, like when he was talking about, you know, weighing the evidence, and that's what it comes down to. Like, I mean, like I said, I haven't proved a damn thing. It's just, you know, how much confidence do we have in this? Then we get new evidence presented, and we say, oh, let's adjust that confidence level. And it's not even just empiricism versus rationalism. So when Mike talked about being a late adopter, a nice little anecdote. There was a study that said caffeine anhydrous in supplement form had a more potent ergogenic effect than a similar amount of caffeinated coffee. So same caffeine dose, powder versus coffee, the powder was more effective. And for 15 years, everybody agreed that that was definitely true. We knew it to be true because we had the empirical data. A rationalist would have said, why? Because, you know, it doesn't meaningfully alter the pharmacokinetics. It doesn't, I mean, it shouldn't matter. But the empiricist says, well, we have the data. And for 15 years, nobody bothered to replicate that. And then 3 people tried and all failed. And then in a matter of like 2 years, it went from a thing we've definitely known for 15 years to all of a sudden, like, nobody believes that anymore. So it's not even just rationalism versus empiricism. It's, you know, it's not right or wrong. It's levels of confidence, different sources of data. And like Greg said at the very beginning, empiricism without some degree of logic and mechanistic understanding to tie it together is still incomplete understanding. And so we should always seek to really enhance our understanding as much as possible so we can have the most confidence we can possibly have.
I love the way where this conversation's going. I think both Eric, Mike, you guys have highlighted something I want to kick over to you, Omar, and that is understanding the audience that we're all talking to. I would say probably better than anyone else on this call. And I think a lot of the times the philosophical things that we hold true and the epistemological approaches we take are somewhat contrary to what the consumer operates on. They operate on, I'm looking for someone to give me some confidence because I don't know. I'm insecure. So confident voices ring louder. This is true in politics. This is true in anything. And what you just described, Eric, is that based on what we know, there are a few things that we can speak that confidently about, or at least we should speak that confidently about. And I think it's a hard thing also, and to kind of dovetail with both Eric and Mike were talking about as well. When science is perceived, people are attracted to the excitement behind science and the sexiness of it. So when we have something like an evidence-based hierarchy where we would take a well-done RCT or multiple meta-analysis and put them far higher than some fundamental bench research that connects mechanisms, if I wanted to sound smart to someone, I wouldn't say, yeah, I had these two groups of people lift weights and then I saw what happened. I would say, well, let me explain to you this intricate biochemistry. Let me explain to you how hormones work. Let me explain to you, and your eyes cloud over, and the only thing you understood from that is you're smart. But if I tell you about an RCT that I did at AUT, or that I did with Mike, or that Eric did, those aren't very impressive. You just got a bunch of undergrads in, had them lift weights, and did one thing different between the two, and then the meta-analysis is just taking 30 of those. And it's really simple. It doesn't sound like science. It doesn't sound like the thing that gets sold. So Omar, I mean, it's probably a surprise to some of us who are a little more grounded in like the science, but it's probably not a surprise to you that someone can sell a mechanism and do quite well in the face of a large amount of empirical data that seems to go against it.
Yeah, that's a damn shame. So first, it reminds me of the episode with Dr. Benhouse, shout out to him, where he was talking about how to make something seem plausible and starting with that mechanism where it's like, okay, like this sounds about right. Or I was thinking about when we had that one with Brad Dieter and Dr. Andy Galpin, and he was talking about that article, the overview, like kind of, I think it was something along the lines of that anatomy of a huckster, like basically how to convince the lay person that what you're saying is true. And I think you can fly in the face of the convention of this. And I have to give a shout out to Greg, actually, in Stronger by Science, where seemingly in the social media space, and I have a question afterwards for Mike Zordos, because he's in academia. He fortunately is not in social media, so he doesn't have to wage these wars. But it's been all too often you will see, even I would argue, put forth in the evidence-based space, that those with more confident voices, so when you create either a system or you set up a structure where it's like, I have the answers, sure, I might not have all the answers, but we know this, is far more appealing. And actually, there's been some things, as an example, with shout out to Jeff Nippard, where even trying to evaluate the literacy of his own audience after attempting to educate them and walk them through the steps and enhance that critical thinking, that because there's so many different sources, and we basically are equating now at this point, you think about any political debate where someone, let's say, not to get into too contentious of a topic, but let's say something like global warming. It's like, okay, let's get a scientist here. We're going to get them on the left panel, and let's get a lobbyist here on the right panel. We're going to give them equal weight to talk about a topic. One is incredibly well-versed in the data of this topic, but we're giving them equal airwave, equal time, right, on it. And we've seen that. That's why we joke a little bit about Joe Rogan, no a shade against him, but just the louder voices being given that space, so to speak. And so for the average person trying to discern what is true, it becomes far and far harder, which is why I do think the work that all you guys do when it comes to mass and having these open conversations are so important. And I would put forth, I would say, Eric, like, I'm not trying to paint this negative picture because like it's all lost. Like, nihilism is the answer. Like, let's just give up. I do think the overall fitness IQ compared to a decade ago has certainly gotten better, but I think we do see these gaps that continue to provoke conversations that essentially kind of like what T-Rex was saying are dead in the water. Like when we talk about the nutrition debates, where it's almost like when it comes to skepticism, like how do we know what we really know? It's like, well, are you applying this both ways, both to the question, the thing you're examining, but also to your prior beliefs, or even maybe with a rationalism, where the same idea is like you have this core belief you want, so you want to set up a logical chain of assumptions or sequence to get you to where you want to be. So you're attempting to look where you want to look. And I actually, I'd be curious maybe for the four of you, because you've participated heavily in academia, and now you've seen the 3 out of the 4 of you, unfortunately, some of the consequences of social media. Would you say that the conversations on social media are less charitable, even within the evidence-based community, compared to academics trying to discuss what the current empirical data shows? What are some of the plausible theories? How can we use maybe rationalism to fill in some of those missing gaps? Do you find, just compared, because 3 out of the 4 of you have participated in both, do you find that it's a little bit more inflammatory in the social media space, depending upon where you go? Or is just kind of, this is just tit for tat everywhere? Because I'm curious myself. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, so before we get into this, can I just say 2 things real quick that I've been wanting to say for a while, but didn't want to interject?
Yep.
Okay,
He's
so
got some stuff to get off his chest.
I do.
Level it.
Yeah, so sit down, pull up a chair. This is going to take a while. No, probably not. So first things first, with regards to convincing people of things. So not just like trying to find the truth, but then also like being able to convey stuff to an audience. I think you're very much correct that confidence matters a lot. But one of the other factors that I think is very important and tends to tilt things in favor of rationalism versus empiricism is that humans just naturally respond to stories and narratives. And a rationalist approach to explaining something and reaching an answer has a built-in narrative. So you say what you're starting with, and there's a logical sequence, like A leads to B leads to C. If you're a decent communicator, you can walk someone through that. They feel like they've been on a journey with you. You have a prepackaged narrative, and people inherently find that more convincing, that connects with them. Whereas, like, if you're an empiricist, you can tell a story, but you have to work at it. It doesn't come prepackaged for you. So if you just go straight to the data, people could be talking about something, and you could say, like, here's 3 PubMed links. Here were the study designs. Here were the findings. Get fucked. Like that has never convinced anyone of anything. And like, I'm kind of calling myself out here because like sometimes I do that. And even if you're making a very strong empirical case for what you believe, a lot of times people won't perceive that as a strong case, because just dropping facts on people, it tends to not be all that convincing. So if you want to approach things empirically and also like have some sort of narrative backing up what you're saying, you do have to put more effort into it. So, you could start with like, stories and anecdotes that will draw people in. Ultimately, like the pièce de résistance will be like the strong empirical evidence at the end, but you can start with mechanisms that kind of build towards what you're going to reveal at the end is the empirical findings, and, walk people through that process. Even though like the first 60% of what you say may be completely unnecessary, just purely from the perspective of building a strong empirical case. And like, if you're approaching things as an empiricist, you do have to go through that extra effort, whereas like that narrative style is already prepackaged for a rationalist. So I think that's one thing that's relatively important, and one reason why I think, at least in my opinion, rationalist perspectives probably win out a little bit more often than they should. The other thing that I was going to say, which I think relates to several of the things we've talked about so far, is so Trex talked about the hierarchy of evidence, and that is specifically the hierarchy of empirical evidence. And that's something that we're pretty well acquainted with, where essentially the stronger evidence is, like, the more directly related it is to the context you're interested in. The easier time you can have ascribing causality to the results, the more robust it is. So, it's going from bench work all the way up to meta-analyses. So that's like specifically empirical stuff. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that a similar type thing applies to rationalist arguments as well. So I too am much more on the empiricist side of things. I don't think that will come as much of a surprise to anyone. However, rationalist arguments can be very, very strong and sometimes be stronger than like a relatively weak empirical case. And when you're evaluating how strong a rationalist argument is, there I think are two things to keep in mind. One is how directly causal are the preceding steps in your chain of logic. So, for example, I think supplement research ideas are pretty good examples here. So, I think these days people probably don't recommend beta-alanine quite as much as they used to anymore. But, you can talk about the mechanisms of beta-alanine. So it increases the buffering capacity a little bit. So it will take you a little bit longer to induce acidosis in a muscle. Maybe you can complete a couple more reps. Maybe that's going to increase the amount of training volume you can tolerate by like 5-10% possibly. And then on down the line, who knows? Maybe that will result in more muscle growth. But you're starting with increased buffering capacity, and then it's like 4 or 5 steps until you actually get to increased hypertrophy. And so that's not super direct. Whereas like, if you looked at anabolic steroids, you see direct increases in muscle protein synthesis, and you see satellite cell activation, proliferation, differentiation, and myonuclei donation. We know that those are 2 very important things for muscle hypertrophy. And so like you see that shit in vitro, you make sure it works in vivo as well. And who knows, maybe it's not going to cause more muscle growth. Like, I mean, at this point we know it does, but like 30 years ago, you might be able to say like, jury's still out. But like, there's, there's one step. You're synthesizing more muscle protein. Getting big is about synthesizing more muscle protein. You're much closer from A to B there than you were with beta-alanine. So, if you're dealing with a more direct causal mechanism, you can be more confident. I think the two places, or I think the place where that is seen the most clearly is if you're talking about weight gain and weight loss. Because ultimately, we know that comes down to energy balance. And even if you don't necessarily have strong empirical results about something in particular, if you know that it impacts energy balance, you can surmise that it's probably going to have a fairly strong impact on body weight. Because like every step of that is pretty well understood. And ultimately, like energy balance is reflective of mass going in and out. So, how much carbon are you ingesting, and how much water and ammonia and carbon dioxide are you excreting? And then like basically what is the energy value at every step along the way? Like that is all stuff that's like almost perfectly well understood. And so like, there is still a slight extrapolation, maybe going from an acute study finding to assuming that it's going to pan out longitudinally, but that's something that's very, very direct. Whereas something like, maybe the impact of body fat on inflammation, on hypertrophy isn't quite as direct because, with body fat, one question is like, where is that body fat? So visceral fat is going to cause more inflammation than subcutaneous fat. Other lifestyle factors are going to influence how much of an inflammatory effect visceral fat has. And then the actual like inflammation pathway itself, if you actually like chart out all of the biochemical steps between, various inflammatory processes to actual impacts on muscle protein synthesis or breakdown, like there's another 7 or 8 steps between A and B there. And then that's still like acute. And then you have to see like, is that going to pan out long term? So instead of, A to B to C, you're kind of dealing with like A to B to C, et cetera, to T. And so like the more directly causal we know a cause is to its effect, and the fewer additional steps there are between the mechanism or cause you're interested in and the outcome you're interested in, the stronger that logical argument will be. So yeah, you can evaluate rationalist arguments in much the same way you can an empirical argument. So if you're dealing with like an A to B to C to D to F argument, that is a weaker argument than an A to B to C argument, which is weaker than an A to B argument. And if A necessarily entails B, or, you know, two things are correlated with an R of like 0.95, you can have a lot more faith in that than like, you know, A influences B, but D, E, and F also influence B. So, you know, maybe if you do have a tweak in A, you won't necessarily see the outcome in B that you're expecting. So yeah, the closer two things are, the fewer things that also influence the outcome you're interested in, and how directly and necessarily causal those two things are going to have a really, really large impact. So you can have very, very weak rationalist arguments, or with the example that Mike talked about with, you know, does hypertrophy influence strength gains? You can make a really, really strong rationalist argument there, even if you don't have the best empirical evidence you would want to see. Because in that case, it would be hard to have the best possible empirical evidence, because ultimately, if you're trying to establish a causal relationship, you want to be able to randomize hypertrophy. Like that's the variable you want to be able to randomize, while keeping, you know, volume, intensity, frequency the same. And like, you know, if you figure out how to do that, tell me, because I don't know. And so like, it's going to be hard to have really, really good empirical evidence there. But on a rationalist level, you know, we know that cross bridges between actin and myosin are what cause muscle contraction. And we know when muscles grow, you know, maybe sarcoplasmic hypertrophy exists, but like, you know, we're not seeing massive, massive decreases in contractile protein density when muscles get bigger. It's like, we know these little things are what's making the contraction happen, and we know you have about the same density of them as the tissue gets bigger. So like rationally, you can conclude that getting bigger is probably going to help it contract harder. You know what I mean? And that's a pretty direct rationalist case. Like causally, the actin myosin cross bridges bring about muscle contraction. You get bigger, you have more cross bridges, you're going to have a stronger muscle contraction. Like that's a very A to B causal type relationship. So like that's a pretty strong rationalist argument. Anyway, that went way longer than I intended it to, but those were the two things I wanted to slide in there.
Well,
Dude, I thought you were gonna go after Omar because he brought up that he took that cheap jab about global warming, and our podcast just picked up ExxonMobil as a sponsor. We announced that today. So I don't know what kind of bullshit you're trying to pull, Omar.
hey, listen, you're on the iron culture clock right now, Trexler. So you're at the behest of our pro global warming lobbyists, and we can let the legal teams battle it out. But
Unbelievable.
In all seriousness, Greg, I think you did a great job of explaining what we meant by House of Cards, because many times that's what we're operating with, and each card in that deck that is made into that house is one of those chains from A to B to C to all the way to whatever. And like, you know, the example I gave earlier of how you can extrapolate to I don't need to eat, there's a ton of steps in that argument, and we know it's obviously false. And I think we see that all the time, and that is one of those ways that you can get outside of some of that obfuscation. You know, if the person has to walk you through all the stuff that mostly just kind of confuses you and shows that they have a very good grasp of physiology, but eventually gets to something that you're a little skeptical of, there might be some BS going on in there. And every step that you have to make that is a non-empirically based rational argument there is a certain arrogance to that, I would put forth. And that's a judgment on my part. But the more assumptions you make, which ultimately there is, I mean, it's not I'd say an educated guess, to be charitable. Every educated guess you make, they compound. And by the end of it, you've made 6 or 7 guesses. And the probability that you're wrong increases, I would say, logarithmically with each one, because there's so much about physiology that we actually don't know. And our body works with feedback loops. And every time we think something should cause something else, there's probably some other feedback loop that we don't even know about. And ultimately, that's why a lot of the times we don't see mechanisms panning out with actual outcomes. And we see it time and time and time again since the advent of science, really. So this is something that I talk about a lot, is that you want to try to use the quote-unquote chain of research, that when you want to make applied outcomes, you don't start with the mechanistic, you get to the translational research, you get to the applied research. And here's something that I think is interesting. I was reflecting on my own career, and I think that during your early stages of academia, you were primarily taught to be a rationalist. You're given textbooks that give you principles, that give you our best understanding of physiology from when the textbook was printed, which is not our best understanding of physiology. And then from there, at a certain point around your master's, you're expected to shift into being empirically minded, which requires, I would argue in most cases, a little more critical thinking, at least in the way it's taught. And now you're supposed to value data, but you haven't been taught to do it. And then as you become a scientist, you become all about the data. And I have found an interesting trend, and I'll speak for myself. I don't want to blame the whole academic system here. I probably was better in my physiological knowledge during my master's than I am now. And in many ways, I've now just become a study reciting monkey that just knows thousands of studies that I've read over the years and has kind of this collective association knowledge of things that seem to have panned out, and kind of this ongoing updating meta-analysis of various topics in my brain based on my best recollection. But I don't really remember, is it 32 or 34 ATP that's generated, and what are the different pieces of a cell? I don't know. Like, my physiological knowledge has probably gotten a little weaker, but my body of knowledge, as far as my collection of empirical data, has gotten stronger. And I think that's an interesting thing, is sometimes I'll run into people who are more on the rationalist side and make some of these false arguments and promote things that I know are not true because I've seen the data. But I think they are actually better than me at physiology. And they are, in some ways, you could argue, quote unquote, smarter. They're just not well read, and they don't value the same type of evidence. And I always find that an interesting thing, that sometimes the highly intelligent person who's a little out in the eccentric left field has connected these dots, and it's kind of this physiological conspiracy theory that's going on in their head. And sometimes they're just trying to sell books, but not always. And I find myself going, wow, you're clearly smarter than me, but you are very dumb. I don't know. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty accurate representation of where knowledge starts off. Because if you're an undergraduate, you're mostly being taught by textbooks, and you're not involved in research, and you're not being taught to read research until, let's say, an upper level class, and maybe your last year, where your professor may post, a couple of papers for you to read. But early on, that's not the case. So most people don't reach that level, and then if they do decide to go on, it's wait a minute, I've never seen this before. I've been told this. And so, I always say to my students all the time, if I'm teaching them, I'll say, as a basic concept, like, have you guys been told to, stretch before exercise? And they say, yeah. And I say, have you ever been shown any data that this is good? They'll say, what do you mean? I'll say, have you ever been shown a scientific study that this is a good idea? No, we do it because obviously it makes sense. And I say, well, hey, check this out. Maybe it's not so good. And of course, there's caveats to that concept, and stretching isn't the evil that everybody makes it out to be. But the point being, I think that at that level, they can then talk about certain things, or talk about a class that they had, and discuss the physiology. There's no doubt about it. So I think I see that all the time as well, Eric. I think, again, getting back to any argument, you can see this if somebody is, an intellectual and is really, really well read on the basics of something. They can theorize to you really well why this should work. but they're not always in the know on the outcomes that this thing has produced. This, either legislation or lack of legislation, either way, if it's a political argument, what has this produced? And they don't always necessarily look at that outcome. And so you see that in physiology, you see that in that. And, while Greg was talking too, I thought of, and I won't mention all of them so we can move on. But while Greg was talking, I thought of like 10 more examples of things that, where you want to minimize the steps to be able to make that justification. And so then I started thinking about the research that we do. And, most lines of research are predicated on some type of rational thought because you have to bridge that gap. And most lines of research fail. So the amount of researchers and scientists, and they fail, but that's okay because they're approaching it not with, I want to show this. They're approaching it with, hey, let's see if this happens, right? We're trying to, it's been well established over the years that with age, cognition declines. And specifically, aerobic exercise can be good to combat that or to attenuate that process. Why does it do that? Well, they started looking at, does aerobic exercise affect neurotrophins, something like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which can create neurotransmitters and cause neurogenesis, which then leads to greater cognition, especially in the hippocampus. It does. And that's awesome. It connects all of that gaps. I'm interested in if resistance training does that. The data is far less. So what am I doing? I'm doing acute studies to see, does lifting weights increase levels of BDNF? And then people say, oh, well, it did. So resistance training is good for neuroprotection. We are years away from making the conclusion from our data. All it did was increase circulating BDNF or peripheral BDNF, right? Not in the hippocampus. And what's amazing about that is circulating BDNF actually decreases as a positive adaptation. So we're saying, hey, this increased. That then is going to have a positive adaptation to decrease circulating BDNF, but increase protein concentrations of BDNF in the hippocampus. That's then, you continue that throughout your whole life. Then this is going to cause neurogenesis and then improve memory. And I'm going to say that from one study where some dudes did some bench press and BDNF went up, right? It's a large step, and it's going to take a long time to get there, and we may never get there, and we may find out that this isn't the case. So anyways, it just made me think of that while Greg was talking and giving those examples. So there's just one more to throw out there for you. And then I had something else before that, but I forgot, so I'm done.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think it really drives home how rationalism and empiricism aren't anywhere close to mutually exclusive, because we've been talking about like evaluating scientific evidence up to this point, but on the opposite side of that, generating scientific evidence, generally the front end of that is a joint empiricist and rationalist venture. So you basically look to see what's already empirically established, like what mechanisms and relationships to exist, and then rationally derive hypotheses that hopefully aren't too insane. And then, generally like during grad school or like early career researcher, you kind of rationally lay out a research line you want to pursue where, kind of hopefully A leads to B leads to C, and like the big discovery you want to make, hopefully that's waiting for you at the end of the road. But it starts with, understanding mechanisms, understanding the empirical results that are there. And then, at the start of things, just generating rational hypotheses about what hopefully should happen based on what you already know to be true.
Yeah, and I just want to take a moment to admire the point that Mike made. Such a great way to put it. Literally every failed line of research in the history, and you talk to any researcher who's done, 4 or 5 decades of research, and their failed lines of research outnumber the ones that really hit by a wide margin. And so the idea, it's like, no, having a rational argument is totally good enough. I mean, if you talk to any grizzled veteran who's been doing research for a while, it's like, if only, dude. Believe me, I wish, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so like Trex said, having a rational argument is good enough. And then what do? If you have the resources, the access, you test it. And then
Exactly.
if it doesn't work and you don't have the empirical evidence and you can replicate it doesn't work, then you move on. Right? So that's the step. Having the rational argument is indeed good enough. And it is indeed good enough in the absence of other evidence to use to make training decisions, because you have to, again, everybody has to train.
You got to train.
You have to live.
But you have to make decisions on, hey, what do I do here? I'm coaching, what do I do here? But then you test it. And if you test it and it doesn't work, and then it's replicated and it doesn't work, you know, then at a certain point, if you see that, you have to, you're either, if you're not admitting that or you're not changing, somebody's either ignorant or they're lying. And so you have to be willing to do that and change. And to give these guys credit, I'll say for me, and I actually spoke with Helms about this like a week or so ago, and he and I were chatting. Getting in and getting to meet you guys, a few years ago. Well, not Greg, but to meet everybody else. It's huge. I've had to challenge a lot of my own beliefs of training and stuff, but I'm chatting with you guys, and we all do that, and we morph over the years, which is what you need. But you have that rational idea, that's enough, but then you test it. And then what the findings are, then you act accordingly either way. And I think that's important.
That's well said. We've covered a lot of ground. I want to be respectful of all these fine gentlemen's times. And I want to open the floor at this point to anyone who wants to say anything, add anything, because I know that there's a lot of ways this conversation could go. I think we did touch on you said, Greg, they're so far from being mutually exclusive. I would say that if you were to try to be a pure quote unquote empiricist or rationalist, you are far worse than if you were to actually integrate the two. And it's very difficult to see what empiricism would even look like without hypotheses, right? So I think we have to integrate them. So given that and the nature of this conversation and the fact that our audience is not scientists, is there anything, takeaway words, key points that we think we glossed over, or stuff that any of you want to talk about? I will open the floor. Jim.
Yes, I've got, it looks like you have something, Trex. I recently talked a lot.
I'll go after you.
You got it.
Oh, I was just going to say
we're in a Canadian standoff right now.
You can feel that
I was
simmering
hoping you were going to
tension.
defer again, and then we could do a whole bit where we talked mad shit about Omar's nationality, I suppose. But never mind, it's fine.
It's a popular topic.
So I was just going to say, building off that point that these two ideas, they're certainly not mutually exclusive. They are good for one another. When our empirical observations are difficult to rationalize, then we might be getting ahead of ourselves, and vice versa. If our rationalized hypotheses don't match the data available, then it's possible that we don't understand the components of our logic as strongly as we think. There's something in the system here that we may not fully understand. And along those lines, I mean, I mentioned with the recent project on P ratios, I genuinely thought people were going to read it and say, wow, that's a breath of fresh air. I'm glad I don't have to worry about that shit anymore. And that wasn't the case. A lot of people push back pretty hard. And it would be very easy to hear the way I joke about it and sound like I'm, defensive, dismissive, things like that. And that actually couldn't be further from the truth. I think when we challenge each other's ideas, especially when we've got a healthy balance of people who are more empiricists and more rationalists in the conversation, I think it's better for everybody. And I can tell you with this particular project, we actually have like time-stamped instances of this idea getting fleshed out better and better, getting deeper into the evidence, getting more nuanced interpretation. Because I can tell you the Mass article was not nearly as good as the Stronger by Science article, which was not nearly as informative as the rebuttal to the rebuttal. And so I'm really grateful that people pushed back and said, Eric, you're full of shit and you're a charlatan and I hate you. because that ultimately made us say, what if we're wrong? Let's dig into this and make more nuanced interpretations and get 1 or 2 or 3 layers deeper into this. Let's get new information into the mix. And so that's an incredibly healthy thing. And I am truly very sincerely grateful for the conversation, because I think everybody benefits from those types of conversations and from always requiring better analysis and better justifications for our beliefs. And it gives us conclusions that we can have increasingly greater confidence in. And ultimately, that should be the goal.
Well said. Greg, you're up.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. So the thing I was going to say, and I was afraid that Trex was going to steal this, is one thing to keep in mind on a personal level is that up to this point, we've been talking about how to come to generalized ideas about generalized truths. So, evaluating scientific evidence based on group means to get an idea of what will tend to work better or worse for most people on average. Or, maybe start with some physiological first principles to therefore deduce what might work best for most people on average. One dimension where I think that this is very applicable for individuals, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why I also kind of tend to lean empiricist. Like, it's not just purely a philosophical commitment. I think part of it is due to just kind of my own personal experiences with my own training. Is, ultimately you're going to be needing to make training decisions for yourself. You got to train. Everyone here is going to lift forever. So you're going to make decisions about how you're going to train. You're going to try some things. Maybe some things work better, some things work worse, and you need to, evaluate it and decide what you're going to do moving forward. And I think that one of the traps that people often fall into is they might get sucked in a little bit too much by generalized rationalist thinking about, if we approach this logically, what theoretically should be the best approach to train? What should I do? How should I train? And it's logical. It's what should produce the best results. And then when it doesn't, it's your fault. Like, maybe you just didn't do it hard enough. Maybe you didn't do it right. Like, whatever. So I think, like, on a personal level, kind of an internalized empiricism is pretty helpful, because that will help you test hypotheses on yourself. So, maybe training's not going well. You're like, okay, I'm going to try something new to shake things up a little bit, hopefully get past this plateau, get progress going again. You try it. Maybe it's perfectly logical. It makes all the sense in the world, and you don't get shit out of it. At that point, it's not your fault. It's probably not the fault of the intervention. You are an individual, and now you have empirical data suggesting that the thing you tried didn't work great for you. So it doesn't matter how rational or logical it was to try it in the first place. You now have evidence showing, like, okay, this didn't pan out for me. So you try something else, and maybe that does work. And then maybe someone on the internet says, you stupid dumbass, I'm in your Instagram comments, and what you're doing seems stupid as shit. And I have some great rational, logical arguments why what you're doing is very dumb and you shouldn't do it. But you should have enough internalized empiricism that you can say, like, hey, this thing you're telling me to do, I don't care how logical it sounds. I fucking tried it before and it didn't work. But the thing I'm doing now is working. So, like, eat shit. Not exactly that, but I think that my meta point here is there's a difference between how you necessarily go about evaluating generalized arguments and lines of evidence, etc., from an empirical versus rationalist perspective, versus how you go about testing things for yourself. And I think that regardless of whether you're generally an empiricist or rationalist, in the broad sense, I do think it's very important and very valuable to have that kind of core of personal empiricism about how you go about evaluating your own experiences and your own results. And you have the courage to trust yourself and put some faith in that.
I think that's really well said. Gentlemen, this has been a really interesting discussion. I love it. And I think for those who listen to this one, I think they're going to hopefully be better thinkers for it. And I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to share your thoughts, share your perspectives, and come on. I want to say, just as a little side piece here, Greg, we've already mended fences with Dr. Trexler, Dr. Eric Trexler, for the record again. But we also want to take that olive branch, wrench it out of the hands of Eric, and then also give it to you, just so that the Stronger by Science podcast is known to now be, if you will so accept said branch, at least loosely affiliated, maybe not allied, with Iron Culture from this day forth. At least present on the same side of the cinematic universe, maybe not constantly doing team-ups, but at the very least allied against the same great darkness that is going to eventually envelop us all. So it's your olive branch to take. You can feel free to respond or not respond on air. Any lack of response we'll assume is in the affirmative.
Hostility. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Omar went a different direction than I did.
I will accept the offer. We can be allies, but we will be allies in the 17th to 18th century European sense. Insofar as it's on paper, on a de jure basis, we are allies. But as soon as it becomes inconvenient, or as soon as there are entangling alliances that maybe make it inconvenient to keep the allyship intact, maybe we'll reevaluate and invade your western flank.
Quick, very, very important caveat here.
Uh-oh.
You just made an alliance with the Fireside Chat sub-series of the Stronger by Science podcast.
Not Stronger by Science.
Which Greg is qualified to speak on behalf of, but you have made no relationship with the Stronger by Science podcast, which has one host.
All right, so I'm going to go... Well, see, the thing is, Eric, we already cleared things up last time, and you gave me a very Zen-like Buddhist response.
Wait a second. Calm down. If you have an alliance with the Stronger by Science podcast already, that's a big fucking problem, because the Stronger by Science podcast and the Stronger by Science Fireside Chat series are currently in a state of open warfare. It's simmering. It's getting there. We're currently in an arms race. We're stockpiling armaments. So I will accept completely unconditionally allyship with Iron Culture in an effort to crush the Stronger by Science podcast under my heel.
All right, Omar, I think the only response we can have to this one is we have just become Switzerland. And I mean that in the more modern sense. And by that, we have no negative or positive comments about either, and we would support no aggression against either or between either, unless not supporting aggression between the two of you would result in aggression towards us. I think it's a pretty clear stance. And it's just good to be able to mend fences, or at the very least, not touch each other's
Build
fences.
even more fences.
So, Trex, I would like to offer an alliance to you for our two very distinct podcasts to maybe attack Iron Culture.
Okay.
Ooh, I accept.
Okay. Wow.
All right.
So whenever anyone offers me an olive
y'all.
branch or an alliance, I always accept very quickly and gratefully.
Wow. You know what?
So
we're right back to, you know what? It's 2020 again, folks.
Yeah.
It is not 2021. There is no quarter will be held.
No reconciliation.
We're joined by Dr. Derek Drexler, who is supervised by the rogue AI that has clearly had this programming damaged, Greg Nipples. Thank you very much for being on. Mike Zerdos, love you. You're great.
I don't
Shout
understand
out
anything
FAU.
that just happened, by the way.
Thank God I
don't peruse the internet, because it sounds terrible.
Well, you're better for it, and we all wish we could be more like you. Shout out FAU. Shout out the gardening dietitian. Shout out to no one else, and you will not get to shout out any IG's websites,
It's been
previously
revoked.
Previously described as podcasts or anything of that nature. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Omar, why don't you close us out?
So before we just got embroiled in what could only be the next series of conflicts that will be unending, I had conceptualized it like we are the Star Wars cinematic universe. You're the Marvel universe, and we're both under the same umbrella that is Disney Plus, which is science. You know, we have Walt Disney's head frozen somewhere, and that is the holy vestige that we must protect. But now, and there was a theoretical possibility in the future of the two universes colliding. Like all of a sudden, Boba Fett walks into WandaVision, or who knows what it would entail. Now, Greg is just stating in no uncertain terms that they are not only visually distinct and that the universes are distinct, but they're at absolute war. So we try, folks, we tried, but this is just representative of 2020. I want to in particular thank Dr. Mike Zordos for not getting on our shit side, because we've had way too many conflicts, way too many lawsuits. Our lawyers in Delaware are just basically taking all of our resources. The last thing I do want to do, I want to make a public declaration here, Eric, if I may, on behalf of both of us, because see, we rule unlike Fireside Chat and Stronger by Scientology, where it's a tenuous relationship. We're joined at the hip, stuck together, some would say.
Yeah, we're connected like a centipede. Tell you what.
Yeah, a human centipede, some would say.
Yeah, you might even describe it as that.
So Greg said some wild shit where he described mass as a collectivist. Right. And we've been battling this notion on Iron Culture once again that, you know, critiques of capitalism. Oh, like, is obesity a consequence of end stage capitalism? That's something James Krieger said. We had to distance ourselves as a whole thing. I want to state in no uncertain terms that not only do we not believe in the redistributing of wealth, we actually believe in the concentration of said wealth in as few hands as possible. In particular, two people ruling atop a pyramid, joint hands stuck together. And I would go so far as to say, I don't believe
potentially a ziggurat pending lawyer decisions.
Yeah. So you watch yourself. And I would say we don't believe in any public property. There's only private property between us, in particular privates. And to that point, Eric, I just got to announce our 2021 calendar of Eric Helms, looking just beautiful, is going to be on sale for the Iron Culture enthusiasts. That will be the top link. It was going to be Stronger by Science. It was going to be Eric Trexler, his Instagram that you should give a follow, Stronger by Science, and the Gardening Dietitian. But we've excised all that, and you can order the 2021 Helms calendar to help us accumulate even further wealth. Top link.
And that's how we're going to get down to OPP, other people's properties. And I think all of that is perfectly clear and logically connected. And Omar,
thank you.
I think we're done here.
We're done. So you can leave a rating review, right? Because we like to give the illusion that there's choice here, and those listening can participate. So yes, if you want to leave a rating review on iTunes, go ahead and leave one. It does help us out. You could also leave a comment on YouTube. We'll do our best to respond. And I suppose re-extending this olive branch, because we don't want to appear like the bad guys here, we will link everyone, all of our guests, their social media, their websites, all relevant information in the description. Do check them out, and we'll catch everyone in that next episode every single Monday.